In the Appalachian forests, a different kind of story was emerging, which was cause for genuine alarm.
I'll repeat something that I heard, and I don't know who gets credit for saying this first, that the Chestnut Blight pandemic was the worst ecological disaster in the history of North America since the Ice Ages. I mean, if you consider the Ice Ages were pretty much a total wipeout.
The American chestnut tree was the tallest tree in the Great Forest and had a lifespan of more than 300 years. It grew rapidly, and when it found a shaft of sunlight, pushed quickly to the top of the canopy. An essential element of Appalachian life for thousands of years.
It was one of the sort of foundations of the economy all through these mountains. People used the chestnuts, the nuts, to fatten their hogs. They sold the nuts, and as well as the lumber. The lumber was extremely important. That barn is made of chestnut. That barn was built 100 years ago, and it's still in really good shape because it's chestnut.
The abundance of game in the chestnut forest was higher than anywhere else. We're talking about all kinds of game animals, from birds to deer and, bear, all the way up the food chain.
Well, we gather the chestnuts when they're in the fall of the year. They have a burr on them. And when those burrs start falling, you wear heavy shoes and you go and you stomp the burrs and get the chestnuts out of them.
They're easily gathered, easy to prepare, easy to store, nutritious food that's good to eat.
Well, you can boil them or roast them, either one. We like to put them in the fire like a potato.
You hear reports in the folklore of the chestnut burrs so thick you literally could not walk up the side of the hill because the burrs were just rolling down in an avalanche.
The old people here say that in the late spring, when the chestnuts were blooming, it would look like snow on the mountains. It was so white, and they were that numerous.
In the late 19th century, however, commercial orchard keepers, desiring to sell chestnuts that were a little bit larger, began importing an Asian species of chestnut from Japan. And it was not long before someone noticed a frightening problem.
In 1904, in New York City, it was noticed that in the Bronx Zoological Garden, some landscape trees, enormous American chestnuts that were old at the time, were dead and dying. They were dying of a disease that had never been seen before. It turns out that they were being killed by a fungus that was accidentally imported on that Japanese chestnut nursery stock. The fungus grows in the bark. It eats chestnut bark. It spread from New York City about 30 miles a year in concentric circles out across the map. And it caused a pandemic. Every American chestnut tree got this disease and died.
A number of years ago, a Cherokee told me that her grandmother had told her that when the chestnut trees began dying, that Cherokees began to hold all-night dances in an attempt to invoke whatever spiritual forces they needed to in order to prevent the death of the chestnut trees.
In Pennsylvania, they tried to cut a fire break across the entire state by removing mile after mile after mile of forest in advance of the wave of the chestnut fungus. Of course, it just leapt the fire break in a single puff of spores. It's the classical example of the exotic pest that just attacks a host that had no defense and completely wiped it out from its native range. It's difficult for me to imagine the scale and the scope of the destruction. But we're talking about billions and billions of trees over thousands of square miles. And the people that lived through that, witnessed this destruction, were sure that the end of the world had come. And if you talk to the old folk and hear the first-hand accounts of how the world had changed and would never be the same again, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
So this golden goose, that had provided so many different kinds of value to people here, just economically, was gone, and it changed the way people lived here.
By the 1940s, the American chestnut was indeed gone, but it was not yet extinct. Because the killer fungus could not live underground, chestnut logs and stumps continued to send out new shoots, which lived only a brief time, but gave a slender ray of hope that someday a blight-resistant chestnut could emerge.